And now joining us on Book TV in London is author Karen Armstrong. 20-plus books, well known in the United States. Karen Armstrong, what do you write about?
I write about religion. I write about all religion. And it's something I never thought I'd do, because I sort of fell into this a bit by accident. My dream had been to become a university lecturer in English literature. And even though I'd been a nun when I was a young girl, I limped away from that experience, wanting to have nothing to do with religion ever again. And then a series of career disasters occurred, one after the other, and I found myself, much to my surprise, on television, presenting some programs, rather sort of controversial programs at that stage, quite angry about religion, for Channel 4 when it was just opening. And then that career folded, and I went off and wrote a history of God. And in the process of writing a history of God, it was 4 years, and I was living on baked beans and tomato sandwiches. It was virtually no money. But it was a very formative period, because in that time, the experience of researching that book completely changed my outlook on religion.
In what way?
Well, for one thing, I was alone, and instead all my television friends had melted away with the disaster of my leaving the TV world, and I was on my own, in silence, in a very remote part of London. Now, theology is poetry, and you really can't learn, you can't read a poem in a nightclub where there's a whole lot of noise and really get something from it. You need to put yourself into a different kind of zone where you're quiet and receptive. So the silence helped. I found that was adding something, and there was no one egging me on to be outrageous in front of the camera. There was just me and the texts started to speak to me in a different way. And the second thing, I encountered a footnote in a very learned book which quoted the French Islamist Louis Massignon, who said that a historian of religion should approach the topic with what he called the science of compassion. And that did not mean science in the sense of physics or chemistry, but scientia, the Latin, which means knowledge, a knowledge that you arrive at by compassion, which doesn't mean feeling sorry for people, but putting yourself in their shoes, feeling with the other. And he said you can't approach the spiritualities of the past from the position of post-Enlightenment rationalism with a sort of superior air, which is what I'd been doing all this time. You had to put yourself on the back burner and enter in a scholarly way, reproducing all the circumstances in which a particular spirituality grew up. The educational, economic, financial, political, social circumstances, and not leave it until you can find yourself feeling the same. That in those circumstances, you would have felt the same. And he said in that way you broaden your horizons and you make a place for the other in your mind and heart.
Well, Karen Armstrong, why did you become a nun?
Well, I was 17, and you know how it is when you're young. You're very sort of idealistic and stubborn. I would not take advice from my poor parents, who were appalled at this idea.
Were they faithful Catholics?
Well, they were Catholics, but we did Catholic light. We zoomed into church on Sunday early to get it over with, and then we weren't a religious family at all. Though we went to Catholic schools because that was what you did. But I wanted, how muddled and difficult adolescence is. And I thought that if I became a nun, I'd become sort of Buddha-like and calm and enlightened and inspired and inspiring. And I'd be, like most of the women in the 1950s around whom I was surrounded, they all seemed to be endlessly doing cleaning and cooking and scrubbing and looking after men. whereas the nuns, I could see, seemed wonderfully unencumbered. They seemed to have their minds on higher things. The irony was that when I got into the convent, all I did for years was scrub and cook and clean. And I wasn't very good at it. But it was a sort of mixed idea that all our motivation is mixed. And I was a very shy young girl at that point. Clever, but emotionally a bit backward. I was a bit scared, I think, of going into the big world. But you don't stay in the convent just because you're scared of the outside world, because that you really have jumped from the frying pan into the fire. I mean, it's tough in there. It's like boot camp in a sense, or at least it was in those days. The idea was to train you to be tough, to be a strong woman, and that meant that, you were treated really quite very harshly indeed often. And eventually I had to give it up after 7 years.
What happened to your spirituality once you gave it up?
As I say, I just wanted nothing to do with religion at all.
Atheist?
No, I mean, well, probably, yes, probably. But, even that sounds a bit sort of rebellious in the sort of Hitchens-Dawkins field. For me, it was just a weary giving up. I mean, I'd been hopeless in the convent at prayer, which, as you can imagine, was a bit of a drawback for a nun. So every morning I would struggle with my meditation and completely fail at it. And I seemed to have opened myself to God, and God had just taken no notice. So once I got outside, God simply slipped away. I mean, however much I tried to bring him into my life, he seemed to have sort of declined the offer. And I just, it just sort of fell away quite painlessly, really, and I just thought, let's leave that. That's something I don't want to go back to.
Karen Armstrong, 20 plus books on religion and God. Later, where are you spiritually? The flippant answer to that is convalescent, I think. I'm still in recovery, but my books and my study and the research I do for it is my form of spirituality. Sometimes, when I'm sitting at my desk doing the science of compassion, putting yourself to one side and entering into the minds of thoughts of some of the most wonderful things that have been written, I feel moments of uplift, moments of mini-seconds of transcendence. Now, my Jewish friends tell me I should have been a rabbi, because they say that's what Jews do when they study Torah and Talmud. They don't talk to God, and I can't talk to God. But you study, and by immersing yourself in that study, you get lifted somehow onto a higher plane. And also in the Benedictine order, monks are advised to spend hours every afternoon in what they call divine study, where you immerse yourself in a text and you get mini-seconds of oratio or prayer. And I suppose that's my form of spirituality. I can't see any one of the major world religions that I've been studying up until now that is any better than any of the others. I don't see any of them as superior. Each one of them has its own particular genius, its own particular take on what we call the sacred and the good life. And each has its own particular flaws or drawbacks or failings, because these are human institutions as well as sacred ones. So at the moment, it's an unorthodox position, but I get nourishment from my study of them all, I think. What's the most frequent question people ask you?
What you've just asked, where are you now? What they ask me about death a lot. What do you think? Surely you know what religion's all about, the afterlife, and I'm very conscious now that I'm coming into the last phase of my life. So many people I know who've died, and I seem to be heading up there to be next in the queue, as it were. And I have no thoughts about the afterlife. And one of the things I've discovered is that that is not a religious preoccupation, really. It's really only Christianity and Buddhism, and Christianity and Islam, I should say, that have this preoccupation with afterlife. Judaism doesn't have it. It's a bit of an option. And in the East Oriental traditions, the trick is to vanish. You have reincarnation. But what enlightenment is means you won't be reincarnated. You won't come back. You'll be somewhere where you can't know. And there's very little about the afterlife in the Bible, actually. It's a later idea. St. Paul, when asked what happened to the faithful when they died, said, "Eye hath not seen, ear hath not heard, nor hath it entered into the heart of man what things God has prepared for those that love him." I don't know, you say. And that's good enough. If it's good enough for St. Paul, it's good enough for me. I'm prepared. My feeling is that if you to live, what we have is now. This moment is all we are certain of having, and so to live as fully and as kindly and as creatively as you can in that moment, I think constitutes a kind of immortality.
Some of the names of Karen Armstrong's books include A Case for God, A History of God, The Battle for God, Faith After September 11th, and The Bible, a Biography. Going to the history of God, has mankind always had a spark of thinking there's a higher power out there?
Well, a higher power, no. I mean, that's putting it in a rather sort of Western modern way. But certainly a sense of transcendence. Our minds are so constructed that we naturally tip into, have experiences and ideas that we can't explain. We seek it in all kinds of venues. In art, for example, music lifts us. And there's that moment at the end of the concert when the last notes of the symphony die away, and there's often a beat, a very full beat of silence in the concert hall before the applause starts. And you can't put it into words what you feel. That is something that we have, and people look for it in all kinds of outlets, in dance, in music, in drugs even. And religion has been one of those outlets, and religion has always expressed itself best in terms of art, in terms of poetry and song, and music and architecture, and painting. It's not so, and words, very much so, as long as the words fade away, as the last notes of the symphony. Good theology should put you to live for a moment in that beat of silence, where you realize you've come to the end of what thoughts and words can do. And we seek these moments out because we feel we are inhabiting our humanity more fully than usual. We feel enhanced, lifted up, and you can't say what it is. That's what we've always said. That's how our minds are. And we're also creatures that worry. We have great anxiety, whereas dogs don't seem to have a great deal of anxiety about the canine condition or what will happen to them in the afterlife or the plight of dogs in other parts of the world. We do. And we can fall very easily into despair if we can't find some meaning in our lives. And that quest for some kind of meaning goes right back to the caves of Lascaux in southern France, where you have art and cult and religion and hard work. Religion's hard work. Though if you've ever gone anywhere near those caves, to get in to paint those things, it was about a mile into the mountain. A mile underground, very dangerous, cold, frightening, and we see those cave paintings more clearly than they ever would, because they were just working with flickering little matches, and so but they were creating. They were dealing with the perplexity, we think, of how you live with the fact that you have to kill other creatures, all these beautiful animals. that Stone Age man who hadn't developed agriculture was entirely dependent upon, and looking at these animals as gods and honouring them in some way, and coping with the whole perplexity of our through art and some kind of cult that went on there. So that's what we've always done, but it is hard work. And it's not just a question of popping into church and singing a couple of hymns, or that you'll get enlightenment instantly, as I thought I would when I was a young girl. It requires a constant going beyond selfishness.
What's the history, this is a terrible question, but what's the history of organized religion? When did it begin?
I would say, I'm looking back now, probably to when you start having cities and states. Prehistory, of course, we don't know how they organise things, but once you have the organisation of a state, or mini-states or beginnings of agricultural settlements, that is imbued with religion. Until the modern period, every single political organisation or political ideology was suffused with religion. There was no part of life which was cut off, as we do in the modern period, and cordoned off for religion. The Romans had no idea of religion in our sense, a private activity. Nor was religion for the Greeks or the Romans confined to one day a week, or certain times of the day. It was involved in all the great events of your life. It just suffused everything. In the modern period, by taking religion out, it's like taking the gin out of the cocktail. Religion has suffused everything, and now we are trying to extract it. There are good reasons for that. So I think once you have people living together, they struggle with the difficulties of living together and the difficulties of having enough to live on as a community, organising the economy, organising warfare with rival communities wanting your resources. And then religion gets kind of statified, in a sense. It becomes part of the apparatus of the ancient state.
What are the similarities, Karen Armstrong, between Islam, Christianity and Judaism? Well,
they all worship the same God. Islam, for example, the latest one is very, very clear. The Quran, that you cannot be a Muslim unless you also believe in Jesus and Abraham and Moses and all the great prophets of the past. And they're all faiths that have sensed the divine in the workings of history. That somehow the divine is known in current events. That it's not like the Buddhists, where you extract yourself from history, or the Hindus who say that history is Maya, it's just passing, ephemeral, and has nothing to tell us. The Jews, Christians and Muslims all scrutinize history quite hard, struggle with it. The prophets of Israel, for example, you see them they were like political commentators. They were very much commenting on the turbulent history of the Middle East in their time, looking at the great empires, looking at all the political problems, and trying to find the hand of God in that. And Islam the same. Throughout their history, Muslims have agonized about the state of the Muslim community, which is supposed to be a just and decent society. And so when they see their community in the hands of corrupt, ineffective leaders, or they see their community sort of defamed by foreign people, or humiliated or disgraced, they can have the same kind of dismay as a Christian who sees the Bible desecrated. It's so that and all the great, especially in the early days of Islam, the great spiritualities, Sufism, Shia, jurisprudence, philosophy, they all developed from a political contemplation of the present. How do we find God, or how do we serve God in these particular circumstances?
Does that lead to fundamentalism when people are upset
No. It upset, yes. Every fundamentalist movement I've studied in those three religions has begun with what's perceived to be an assault by the secular or liberal establishment. In Christianity, for example, it begins in the United States, in the North, in Chicago, in fact, when the liberal members of the Chicago Divinity School at the university attack the Moody Institute, a much more conservative school on the other side of town, and tell them it's time of World War I, that they're on the side of the Germans. And they hit back, and that's when it begins. And similarly, and it's very much a response to modernization. Modernization's difficult. We are now we've got through to the other side of it, but when it took us 300 years in Europe to develop our modern society, and it was a time of great turbulence with wars of religion, bloody revolutions, followed by dictatorships, followed by the abuse of children and women in the factories, the despoliation of the countryside. And now we look at other parts of the world going through that same process, and what do we see? Bloody revolutions, reigns of terror, dictatorships, wars of religion. Modernization demands. It's not just a question of getting a few skyscrapers or computers or fighter jets. It's a question of reorganizing your entire society around a different kind of economy.
Karen Armstrong, you've also written about the city of Jerusalem.
Yes.
Why is Jerusalem Jerusalem?
Why is it such a problem, you mean?
Why did it become the place where all three of the major religions of the world all claim, the conflicts there, etc.?
Well, it's what we were talking about just earlier, about the concentration on history and historical events, and the fact that Jerusalem was very key to the people of Israel in their history, in biblical times, and that Jesus died there, for example, made it a sort of central place. The cultivation of a holy place is one of the oldest and most universal forms of religious expression. Pilgrimage to a holy place. You find it in absolutely every culture. It's one of the earliest, as I say, that's recorded. And it seems to be that it's a form, before we mapped our world scientifically, we developed a sort of sacred geography, where certain places were absolutely central to us and gave us our sense of where the world and where we are. So in Islam, it was a holy city because it was holy to Muslims and Jews, Christians and Jews, whose prophets they celebrated. And on the Muslim haram in Jerusalem, you have shrines dedicated to the prophets of Israel. There's parts of it for Jesus as well as for Muhammad. So that it's again a sense they're expressing their sense of continuity there with the past. It becomes a sort of contested place when people think it belongs to them, and that's the issue. A holy place. The point of a holy place is it doesn't belong to anyone; it belongs to God, and you somehow have to sort of negotiate that in some way. Once you start saying "me" and "mine," you're beginning to lose the plot there. But no, it's part of that universal urge to sort of centre yourself. When Muslims, for example, or Jews, or Christians indeed, pray in the direction of Jerusalem, a lot of churches oriented to face Jerusalem, people die and they're buried facing Jerusalem, as it were. It's saying, where do I belong? What's my orientation? Where am I headed? When Muslims turn 5 times a day towards Mecca, the action of saying, now where's Mecca now? It's an exercise that says, where am I going with my life, really? You interrupt your work, whatever you're doing, and point yourself in the direction where you feel you should be going. It's a reminder of what your priorities were are. And that's something that occurs nearly in every faith, this kind of just a reminder, where am I headed? Where is my true centre?
You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2, and we are visiting London, talking with British authors. Today, author Karen Armstrong, the author of over 20 books about religion. While we're taping this, Ms. Armstrong, there's an election of a pope going on. What are your thoughts about the whole process?
Oh heavens, I was looking at it last night and I thought that, there really must be a simpler way of doing this, but perhaps that's not very kind. Who has really found a decent way of electing people? We're always having problems with our votes or counting things here. The process, I think, is just what it is. My feeling is that it won't really make much difference who is elected, because I think that the last two popes have been very conservative, and John Paul II had a long time to plant conservative bishops and cardinals in all the great sees, so that I think it'll be one of those. But some people who've been Catholics become kind of professional ex-Catholics, as it were, and if they're not Catholics anymore, they feel it their duty to be endlessly fulminating about the Catholic Church. I don't at all. In many ways, I'm very grateful to the Catholic Church because for its liturgy, its ritual, which formed me, I think, and I have a much more Catholic soul than Protestant soul in that way. I take Scripture much more lightly than Protestants, and I find, now they've lost it, of course, the beauty of the Gregorian chant, which I learnt as a young nun, is a spiritual thing. It's a spiritual thing that I'm very grateful for. But when it comes to the Vatican, I find my heart just sinks. There have been all these scandals. There's been the sex abuse cases. I wish that we could have a pope who could come out and say, look, we've really lost the plot in recent years. Sex abuse, this has got to stop. We've got to speak kindly now for other people. We've got to look with contrition at the things that the church has done to people, persecuted people in the past. And let us repent, but let us move forward in some way in charity and peace towards the rest of humanity and reach out. That's the challenge of our world, I think, for religious people. Not to be stuck in your own little box, but to deal with the fact that we are sharing the world now, and with with people who are very different from us. And unless we learn to treat one another, whoever they are, with greater respect and compassion, we are not going to have a viable world. Because however separate and special we think we are, the reality is we cannot live without one another. We are interdependent as never before. When stocks fall in one part of the world, markets plummet all the way around the globe. Economists will tell us that a poor economy in Africa will redound on London and New York. We are linked together by the World Wide Web. We are politically joined, so that what happens in Afghanistan today can have repercussions in London or New York tomorrow. And yet we've created this global market. This is our own creation, this interlinking, this interdependence. And yet our perceptions haven't caught up with this yet. We still think we can sit back from it all and we're separate and we don't need, and the world will, if we don't achieve a global outlook, I think the world will come to us, sometimes in a terrible form.
One of your more recent books is A Letter to Pakistan. What is that book about?
Well, I go to Pakistan a great deal. They treat me like a kind of rock star there.
Why?
Because they're hungry to hear a friendly Western voice, I think. And I won the TED Prize in 2008, which gives you a wish for a better world. which Ted will try to make happen. And I suggested the Charter for Compassion, which was written by leading activists and thinkers representing 6 of the major world faiths, as a sign that, despite our many differences, on the issue of compassion and the Golden Rule, we were all in agreement, and we could write this together and work together for a better world. Well, one of the people that's picked up is Pakistan, which is one of the leaders of the Charter. So I went out there to launch the Charter in 2011. It was a most uncompassionate schedule because I was talking for 3 huge lectures every day, but they came literally in thousands, and they're working to create a network of compassionate schools over there. So when I came out there, the person who was bringing me, the young businessman who was bringing me, said, you know, your book, I wrote a book called 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life, just a little book. He said, but it's an imported book, and they're very expensive. So can you persuade your publisher to waive the rights in Pakistan so that it can be either sold cheap, or else let the Oxford University Press, which has a huge franchise in Pakistan, do a very cheap edition of it. I thought, well, when they'll never agree to that when hell freezes over. So I said, well, in a weak moment, I heard these words coming out of my mouth and tried to pull them back. I said, well, perhaps I could write a little book, especially for Pakistan, this weekend, doing the 12 steps to a compassionate life from a Pakistani Muslim perspective, and looking at it in Islamic terms. So that's what it was. And then at the end of the book, we invited mullahs and scholars and journalists to comment on it, so that I said, this is your letter, and you know, this is your charter, you'll make of it as you wish. Actually then, my publisher then said, of course we will waive the rights. So they also did a cheap edition of the 12 steps to...
Why 12 steps?
Alcoholics Anonymous, of course. Because compassion requires that the Golden Rule, never treat others as you would not wish to be treated yourself. It requires that you look into your own heart, discover what gives you pain, and then refuse under any circumstance whatsoever to inflict this pain on anyone else. And Confucius, the first person to enunciate the Golden Rule, as far as we know, said you do it all day and every day. Now here in England we have a habit of saying when we've done something nice for somebody, well, that's my good deed for the day, as though you can then return for the next 23 hours to your usual greed and unkindness and selfishness. No, all day and every day. And this means you have to lay aside your ego. Now we are addicted to our egotism. We need to be, otherwise we wouldn't have survived as a species. But we are also addicted to our pet hatreds, to our likes and dislikes, and we don't know what we'd do without them, because the people we really dislike are often a foil to our own sense of our own selves. We are everything that those people are not. And so we depend upon them, like an alcoholic depends upon the drink. And sometimes when you say something vile about your ex-wife or your unpleasant boss or people with whom you're at war, and you can get a sort of buzz, a sort of rush of righteousness, and this just as the first drink of the evening, or of the day if you're an alcoholic, and this it gives you that kind of rush and ego-full, prideful moment, and so this is an addiction, and we can only wean ourselves from that gradually, as they do in Alcoholics Anonymous, day by day, step by step, by gradually incorporating more empathic ways of living into your daily living. And I believe, really, why I have a sense of urgency about this is that unless we now learn to implement the Golden Rule globally, so that we treat all peoples, whoever they are, as we would wish to be treated ourselves, the world is not going to be a livable place.
Karen Armstrong, another one of your books, Faith After 9/11 or September 11th. We were told by many politicians in the States that we weren't at war necessarily with Islam, but with Islamic terrorists.
Well, I would say the word Islamic terrorists is not really valid. These people are not Muslims, they're criminals. People who do these acts, these are criminal acts. And when you keep on saying Islamic terrorism, you get the sense that Islam, segues very easily into terror. This is not so. Often the discourse about Islam is really very scary in the West. Sometimes, I'm asked to write a piece about, if something comes up in the news, and I'll write a piece, saying what the Islamic position really is. And the volume of hate mail that I get is really shocking. This time last year, I was in Canada, and Globe and Mail asked me to do a piece on Islamophobia in Canada. And my hosts were absolutely appalled. There were about, the first day, 500 threatening letters arrived at the Globe and Mail, really sort of ugly stuff coming out. I mean, I've had, and these are not religious fanatics or people in the far right. These are, I write for a good liberal paper here in London, and people would say, we're going to come burn down your house. Now all this hate stuff goes right down the web, and it's a gift to extremists who can then point to their disaffected followers to say, look, they hate Islam, they hate our Prophet, they will never reach an accommodation with us. Warfare and terror is the only way we have. So, of course, there was, and the administration was careful to say this is not a war against religion, but it has segued into that in people's minds. And I wish the media could do a better job somehow of publishing stuff that goes against the grain gives you a greater perspective. Muslims are working more energetically for my charter than Christians or Jews. It has to be said. The largest Muslim organization in the USA and Canada affirmed the Charter last September and are introducing compassion into their own schools in order to train the leaders of tomorrow, and setting up compassionate mosques that are gender-friendly, youth-friendly, and engage in interfaith discussion with local communities. No religion is perfect. We all have our malcontents, and we all have our criminals. And the sooner we sort of learn to separate these criminals from and also see where they're coming from, and not just assume it's Islam that rushes them to do this. I mean, if they'd been doing this, Muslims would have been doing these acts for the last 1,500 years, whereas in fact Islam has a much better record of tolerance than Christianity, Western Christianity at least. It's only in the last 100 years or so, as a result of colonialism, that the disruption of colonialism, that these unfortunate movements have arisen. But the vast bulk of Muslims are as appalled by the events of September the 11th as are we.
Three final questions. If people wish to contact you, do you have a website?
Well, the best place to go is to charterforcompassion.org, and then you can probably reach me there. A.C. Grayling, Professor A.C. Grayling has been part of our series here in London, and he wrote the good book in 2011, A Take on the Bible, an atheistic take on the Bible. But he said in his interview that he has friends who are high authorities in the Church of England who don't believe the resurrection happened. Did the resurrection happen? the gospel doesn't tell us that a man walks out of a tomb, if that's what people have a very bowdlerized and simplified view of what the resurrection is. The Gospels only tell us of people's experiences. They have apparitions. This is not a corpse walking out of a tomb, because Jesus is here one minute, then he disappears the next. Suddenly they see him in another person, in the, when they're walking along. The story of the road to Emmaus is instructive here, I think. You know the story, there was disciples just after the crucifixion, and two of them, and it's important that we're not told which two, because this is all of us, Luke is saying. They're walking along, and they're distressed, and this stranger comes and walks beside them and says, "Look, you seem very upset. Anything I can do to help?" Now, I always think it's just as well that these disciples weren't Brits, because if they were, they'd have said, "Oh no, thanks, we're absolutely fine," and that would have been the end of the whole issue. But instead, they open their vulnerability to this stranger, and they say, "We thought this man was our Messiah, and look, and he's been crucified." And this stranger could have laughed at them and said, "You thought that poor sap was the Messiah," and just made them feel worse. But they opened themselves to him. And as they walk along, he opens the scripture to them. And he says, "Didn't you realize that it's always said that the Messiah will always suffer?" Now, there's nothing in the Hebrew Bible to make any such claim. They're allowing this stranger to change their view of religion. To change their view of their religion and of their Messiah. They come along at the end of the evening, they say, "Stay with us." And he comes in and he breaks the bread. And at that moment he vanishes. Again, human bodies that just don't do that. He vanishes. And they say, "Don't you remember, our hearts burned within us as we walked along the way?" And what Luke is saying, I think, is how we know the risen Christ is first in the scripture, discussing the scriptures with one another. And when two or three gather in my name, there am I in the midst of them. In the Eucharist, in the breaking of bread, and in the stranger, in opening yourself to the stranger, which is what Jews and pagans, Gentiles, were doing in Luke's communities. Mixed communities of Jews and Gentiles, learning to live with one another, learning to accommodate one another, learning about their difficulties, and letting their egos go a bit. And I think we're reading our scriptures in such an unimaginative way, as though did it happen, didn't it happen? That is not what the ancient writers would have thought. This is our modern cut and dried view of history. The Gospels are all a call to action, and Luke is here giving a call to action. This is what you do if you want to know the risen Jesus. Paul, when he says, he's the first account we have of the resurrection, and he's talking about visions. And he says, he appeared first. None of this appears in the Gospels. He appeared first to Peter, then to James, and finally he says to me. He equating his own vision on the road to Damascus with the visions to the apostles. These are visions. And it doesn't stop there. Oh, right, it happened. Right now our lives change. It's a summons to change your life, to a new kind of life, to live according to the new kind of humanity that Jesus had tried to sketch out.
And finally, Karen Armstrong, why do you think your books sell so well in the U.S.?
They don't sell so well here, I have to tell you. I'm a bit of a prophet unrecognised in our own country. But I think there's a great hunger in the US, and I think you're very interested in religion. And sort of, a great curiousness. And I think, over here in Britain, people think all Christians in America are fundamentalists and all clapping and saying hallelujah. And I say, not at all, People very exciting things are happening in the religious world of the US. People are very, very open. They want to, things to make sense, and they very generously allowed me to help in that conversation.
And we've been talking on Book TV with author Karen Armstrong. This is Book TV on C-SPAN 2 in London.
For more information on these and other interviews from London, visit booktv.org and watch Book TV every Sunday at 6 p.m.